In this video, I will teach you everything you need to know in order to start coding in PHP. We will be covering the installation, the syntax, and everything from beginner to intermediate level. So let's start off with the installation. In this video, I'm going to show you how to install XAMPP, which is a free Apache and PHP web server. Let's start off by going to www.apachefriends.org. Now, select the download appropriate for your operating system. I am selecting Windows in my case. Once the download is complete, click the installer to start the installation. It might take a few seconds to start. Just click the Next button to start the installation process. On this screen, you're going to deselect the options you're not going to use. You only need to install MySQL and PHPMyAdmin, because Apache and PHP are automatically selected and cannot be deselected. Next, make sure you remember the installation path, as you will need this when opening Visual Studio Code. Now, select your language and select Next to finish the installation. The installation might take a while to finish. Once it's finished, keep the checkbox selected to open the control panel and click Finish. Once the control panel is open, click the Start button next to the Apache server. You should see a green color under the Apache name. I'm currently getting errors when starting MySQL, and that is because I have MySQL separately installed, but you should not see this error. You can also close this window, but remember to start the Apache web server every time after you reboot your machine. Now you're going to download Visual Studio Code, or just VS Code for short. VS Code is a free code editor supported by Microsoft. Go to the VS Code website and again, select the appropriate download for your operating system. I'm selecting Windows in my case. Once it's completed downloading, just keep clicking Next to install with all the default options selected. Once VS Code has finished installing, you're going to open up a new project folder. Just go to File and click Open Folder. Now, navigate to the location where XAMPP was installed. In my case, it was under C drive under XAMPP. Now, navigate to the htdocs folder. Now, in this folder, you're going to create a subfolder called Learn PHP, and this is where you'll be creating and executing your code from. Now, in order for us to know that our setup is working, let's go ahead and create our first PHP file. Let's call it index.php. And inside our PHP file, we're going to open up with our PHP tags. We're going to use the statement echo, and we're going to write hello world on the screen. We're going to close it with our closing PHP tags. Let's save. And if we go over to our browser, we can access our web server by typing in localhost. Now, this will bring us to the XAMPP default page, which is the dashboard. But if you remember, we created a folder called Learn PHP. So we'll take away the dashboard, type in Learn PHP, and there we go. We see our hello world has printed on the screen. And that should be it for our installation and setup. Next, we're going to look at the basic PHP syntax. Now next, let's look at the PHP syntax. Now, PHP and HTML can work very closely together. That is why you can have PHP code and HTML code within the same file. You just need to specify where your PHP code starts and where it ends. And we do this by writing the PHP open tags, which is the left angle bracket, question mark, and PHP, followed by your PHP code and your closing tag, which is a question mark, right angle bracket. So everything within the open tag and the closing tag are considered PHP code and therefore should follow PHP syntax. Now, in order for us to write something on the screen, we use the statement echo, which is basically printing a sentence or text on the screen, followed by a semicolon. Now, this is considered a statement or a block of code, and each statement and block of code has to end with a semicolon. Otherwise, you will receive errors. Now, you might be wondering why this line of code is not ending with a semicolon. So technically, you don't need a semicolon if it's the last line of code before your closing tags. But it's always good practice to have your semicolon there, because otherwise you might forget it in an important place somewhere in the future. Just to show you that it works, if we go to the browser, we refresh, and you can see we don't have any errors. But like I said, it's good practice to keep it there and to make sure you always add it. Now, sometimes you might want to write comments in your code, and comments are normally there just for informational purposes. It doesn't have any functional value in your code, or it's displayed on the screen. It's just there to give you some information on what the code is doing. For example, if you come back in 6 months to a specific code and you're not sure what it was doing, then you can add it, you added a comment, and the comment will tell you what it's doing. So in order to write a one-line comment, you start with 2 forward slashes, and then you can just say this is a comment. And if you go over to our browser, we refresh, you'll see it is not being displayed on the screen. Now, sometimes you want to write more than one line. And in order to do that, you can start with a forward slash, an asterisk, and you end it with an asterisk and a forward slash. And then anything you write in between these open and closing tags would be considered a comment. So for instance, line 1, line 2, and line 3. And again, if you refresh the browser, you'll see it is not being displayed. Now, the next thing I want to show you is regarding the closing tags of a PHP file. Now, if you only have PHP code on your or in your file, you don't need to add the closing tag. So if we remove that and we refresh, you'll see that everything is still working. Now, it's considered good practice to not include the closing tags if you only have PHP code within your file. And that is because if you add the closing tag and you still have lines or other unwanted white space after your closing tag, you could run into problems when you try to do certain things within your code. And that should be it for our syntax. Next, let's look at some data types. All right, so next let's look at some variables and data types. Now, what is a variable? A variable is an entity with a unique name. And as the name suggests, the value can vary. That's why it's called a variable. Now, the syntax for a variable is as follows. You start writing it with a $, then you need to give it a unique name. I'm going to call my variable name, and I'm going to assign it a value of pixelfix. Now, this is considered a string type because a string is a series of characters. And now we can go ahead and we can display this variable on the screen. So what we'll say is echo name, and we finish it with a semicolon. And if we refresh, you'll see pixelfix is displayed on the screen. Now we can also include string variables or any variable within another string. So let's say we say, hello, I am from. And then what you do is you add curly braces, and then inside the curly braces, you type your variable name. You save, refresh, and there you go. Our variable has been included within our string. Next, let's look at the integer data type. Now, integer is something that is a whole number, anything without a decimal point or decimal value. So for instance, age would be an integer. Let's say 21. Now you'll see that integers are denoted without quotes or double quotes. Now, as soon as I take that and I put it inside quotes, now it's considered a string and not an integer anymore. So let's write it without the quotes and use it as an integer. Again, we can use this and display it on the screen. So let's say age. All right, I see my age is being printed next to it. So let's just add a line break here. And now you can see it's still displayed on the screen. So if we add that to a sentence, so my age is 21, and let's refresh, and there you can see my age is 21. Our integer variable has also now been included into the string. Okay, so let's look at the float data type. Now, a float data type, unlike an integer, it has a decimal value. Let's say, for instance, my interest rate that I'm getting at the bank. That would be something that will have a decimal point. So let's say I'm getting 5.5% interest. And I can include that also within a string, same as with the integer. And I can say my interest rate is, and I can say interest rate. And if I refresh, oh, that is my bad. I did not have a semicolon. Let's refresh, and there we go. Let's just add a line break. And now we have all our information back on the screen. All right, so let's look at the Boolean data type. Now, Boolean is fairly simple. It's either true or false, right or wrong. So let's use this as an example. Do I like burgers? Let's say true, I like burgers. And then let's use it in a string to see what happens on the screen. And let's say, do I like burgers? And then we include our variable, which is like burgers. And let's refresh. And now you can see there's a 1 displayed on the screen. So when a true value gets converted to a string, it's replaced by a 1 value. Now let's see if we change this to false, what happens? Now there's nothing. So as you can see, false values are not being displayed when it's converted to a string. Now let's look at some arithmetic operators. There are a lot of arithmetic operators in PHP, but these are the most common ones you'll encounter: addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, modulus, and exponentiation. Addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division are pretty much self-explanatory, so I don't really need to go further into them. The one we'll be looking at is modulus. Now, modulus is an operator that returns the remainder of a division. So in this case, we have 10 divided by 5, which then gives us 0. So if we change, say, the 5 to a 3, what we're going to get is 1, because 3 times 3 is 9, and 1 is the remainder. You would also use the modulus operator to check whether a number is odd or even. Let's take 10, for example. If we work out the modulus with 2 and we refresh, we'll see that the remainder is 0, meaning that number 10 is an even number. If we say take that to 11, we refresh again, the remainder is 1, meaning that the number is odd. Now, exponentiation calculates the power of a number. So in this case, we've got 10 as the base number, and we power it to the number 2, which means it's 10 times 10, and that gives us 100. All right, so let's look at some assignment operators. Now, the basic assignment operator is the equal sign. So it means that you've got a variable and you assign it a value of 10, which then echoes out on the screen. The value of A is 10. Now you've got your increment operator, which takes the number and you increment it by 1. So it would have been the same if you said A equals A plus 1. So, but for shorthand, you just write out A plus plus. Same goes for A minus minus. That would have been A equals A minus 1. But shorthand, you just write A minus minus. Now, if you want to increment with more than 1, you would use the plus equals operator. That would be the same as when you write A equals A plus 3, for an example. By shorthand, you just write A plus equals 3, would give you 13 in this case. Same with the subtraction. If you want to subtract with more than 1, you would write the minus equals and then the number, in this case 3 again. So it would be A equals A minus 3. So it would give us an answer of, or it will give us a value of 7. Now let's look at some comparison operators. The first one we're going to look at is the equal comparison. Now, when PHP tries to compare two values to each other, it will automatically try and convert them to the same type and then compare the value of the variable. So in this case, we have an integer 10 and we have a string 10. So behind the scenes, PHP is going to convert into the same type and then compare the value. So if we use this operator, you'll see that the value of the two variables is true. Now, when you use the identical operator, you're telling PHP you don't want PHP to automatically convert into the same type and then do the comparison. You want to compare the type and the value. That's why you'll use the 3 equal sign in order to check whether two variables are identical. So in this case, we both have integer for A and B, and they have the same value. And that is why they'll return true for the comparison. Now, the same goes for the not equal and the not identical operators, but just in reverse. So the next one we're looking at is the bigger than operator, which just checks whether the first variable is bigger than the second one. Then we have the bigger or equal than, meaning that it checks whether the first one is bigger or equal than the second. Then we have the less than, which checks whether the first variable is smaller than the second one. And then we've got the less or equal than, which checks whether the first variable is less or equal than the second one. Now let's look at the if statement. What is an if statement? An if statement is a conditional statement that will execute a block of code when the condition is met or it's true. Now, this is what the syntax of an if statement looks like. You started with the word if, then your condition would be in brackets. You would have your open curly bracket. You would have your block of code or your statement. Then you have your closing curly bracket. Now, this is a if statement. All right, so let's refresh and see what happens. Great. So the condition was true, so the code was executed. Now, why was it true? We've assigned the value 10 to A, and then we checked whether A is identical to 10, meaning it's true because it's got the 10 value and it's got the integer as the type. That's why the condition was true and this code executed successfully. Now, if we change this to 11 and refresh again, the line should disappear. Now, because this statement was false, so the condition was not met, and that's why this line of code was not executed. Okay, so now in addition to the if statement, it has an else statement as well. What does that mean? It means that if the condition fails, it won't execute this line of code. So when the condition fails, it will execute this line of code. So if we go and refresh, you'll see the condition was false, so this line was executed. Okay, so in addition to your else statement, you also get the else if statement, meaning that you can check multiple conditions within the same if-else code block. So if your primary condition fails, it will then go on to check whether the secondary condition is met or not. So in this case, let's refresh, and there you see the primary condition failed, but the secondary condition was met, and that is why this line of code was executed. All right, next, let's look at some logical operators. Logical operators let us combine multiple conditional checks in the same if statement. For example, you have 3 main logical operators, which is the AND operator, the OR, and the NOT. Now, if we look at the AND operator states that all the conditions that are checked needs to be true in order for this code to execute. So currently our A is 10, but our B is 12. So if we refresh, we're going to see no condition was met. So let's change this to 10. We refresh, and then we can see, yes, that is executed, meaning that both the conditions were met, and that's why this line of code was executed. Now, if we look at the OR operator states that either one of the conditions needs to be true in order for this line of code to execute. So if we refresh this now, we'll see that yes, either one of the conditions were met, meaning that A is 10. That condition was met, so the code was executed. Let's say we change this to 14. So none of the conditions would meet. And if we refresh, it says there, no condition was met. Okay, so now if we look at the NOT operator checks the value and then it inverts whatever it receives. So for instance, if the value originally was true, it'll change it to a false, and vice versa. So if it was false, it'll change it to true. So currently our A is equal to 14. So the comparison would be if A is identical to 10, which it's not, so it's false. But we change it with the not operator, so that makes it true. So this line of code would then execute if we refresh. And there we go. A is not equal to 10. So if we change A to 10 now, which is the inverse, meaning that A is identical to 10, which is true, and then we change it to false, means that this line of code is not going to execute, this one would. So if we now refresh, none of the conditions were met. That's why this line executed. All right, next we'll be looking at arrays. An array is a grouping or a collection of related data, and it can be viewed as a collection of a key value pair items. You get two types of arrays. You get a numerical array and an associative array. Now, a numerical array is an array or a collection of items, but behind the scenes, each item has a numerical value for the key. So in this case, item 1 would have a key of 0, and numerical arrays always start with the key 0. Then you have a 1, which is item number 2, and you have the key 2, which is item number 3. And if you dump this out on the screen, you'll see exactly that. You see the first item would have key 0, which is item 1. Key 1 is item number 2. And key 2 is item number 3. Now, an associative array is an array or a collection of data that has a named key, meaning the key is not numerical, but it has a name or a string as the key. So in this case, the key is name, the value is pixelfix. The key is age, the value is 21. And as you can see, in both numerical or associative array, you can have multiple data types as the value in the array. And if we dump out our associative array, you'll see that is exactly that. The name comes through as the key, and it's got a value of pixelfix. Age is the key, and it's got an integer as 21 for the value. All right, let's look at a for each loop next. A for each loop is a block of code that iterates over every element of an array. It allows you to get the item of an array, perform some actions on it, and then move on to the next item in the list. So if we take our numerical array as an example, we are going to print out the key and the value for each item in our array. Now, if we look at the syntax, you see we can start with the word for each. We've got an opening and closing bracket. Then we've got an opening and closing curly bracket. And then our code that we're going to execute is going to sit inside of our curly brackets. And then we take our array, place it inside the brackets, and say we want to split it up by using the as keyword, and we want to split it up as a key value pair. And then we can go ahead and print it out on the screen like this. We say the key is the key value, and the value is the value. And we just add a line break. And then if we refresh our screen, we'll see that our first key is 0 because it's a numerical array. Our first value is apples. Our second key is 1, and our value is pears. Our third key is 2, and our value is bananas. And now we can do the same thing for our associative array. It works on the same principle. We'll split it up as a key value pair, and we print it out like so. So if we now refresh our browser, you'll see the key came through as name, because we set the name as the key, the value as pixelfix, and the next item in the array was age, and the age was 21, like this. All right, so next let's look at a for loop. Now, a for loop is a statement that executes a block of code a certain number of times. And the syntax is as follows. You start with the word for, you've got your open and closing brackets, then you've got your open and closing curly brackets, and the code you're going to execute that number of times is going to be inside of your curly brackets. Now, inside the brackets for the for loop is where you define the conditions under which your for loop should execute. The first parameter is the counter, and you can set it with a default value or the starting value of 0. The second parameter is the condition, meaning that the for loop will execute while this condition is true. And the third parameter is the increment or decrement parameter for the counter. Now, if we refresh the page, you'll see hello world has been printed 10 times. Let's just add a line break here. Then that should look a little bit better. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Now we can also change this, and we're going to echo out our index to see what our index is at any given time during the iteration. So we're just going to say we want to print out the index is, and we're going to print out I. And if we refresh, we can see the index is 0 up to 9. All right, and we can also change the parameters. We don't have to just increment by 1. Let's say we want to increment by 2. So what we'll do is we say plus equals 2. And if we refresh, then you can see it started counting in 2s. We can then also say, or we want to count in 3s. If you refresh, you can say it's 0, 3, 6, 9. We can change it again. Let's say we want to start at 1 and we want to increment by 2. If we refresh, then you can see it's counting in 2s starting from 1. Now, the same thing we can do with the decrement. Let's say we start at 10. We want our for loop to execute while our index is bigger than 0. And let's say we want to decrement by 1, meaning that we're going to say minus minus. All right, and if we refresh, then you can see our index started at 10 and it's gone down to 1. Okay, next let's look at a while loop. Now, a while loop is also a statement that executes a block of code while the condition is true. Now, in our example, we're still going to use a counter. So we're going to say the condition is true, meaning that the code will execute. It's going to print out the counter on the screen. It's then going to increment the counter. Then it's going to check whether the counter is equal to 10. And if it's not, it'll skip the if block and it will continue executing until the counter is 10. Then it will set the condition to false, which will then stop the execution of the code. So let's refresh and see what happens. And there we go. We've got our counter from 0 to 9. Next, let's look at a switch statement. Now, a switch statement is a block of code similar to an if-else statement that executes code based on a certain condition. And the syntax is as follows. You start with the word switch, then you have your open and closing brackets, then inside you have your variable which you're going to validate. Then you have your open and closing curly brackets, and then inside the curly brackets you have your conditions, the conditions you want to validate your variable against. Next you have the word case, followed by your condition, a colon, and then the line of code you want to execute. And that is followed by the word break, because you need to tell PHP that you want to break the execution of your code. Otherwise, it'll continue and it will execute all the rest of the switch statement. So let's see this in action. If we refresh, you'll see currently the status is draft. Now, if I comment that line out and I refresh, then you can see the status is active, meaning that it executed this line of code and then broke the execution. Let's see what happens if we remove the break. We refresh, and now as you can see, it executed this line of code and it executed that line of code. That's why it is important for you to keep your break after every case statement. Next, let's look at functions. Now, a function is a piece of code or a piece of reusable code that normally takes an input, does some processing on it, and then returns a value. So in our example, we have a function called sum, which takes two arguments. It adds them together and then returns the result. So we are going to say A equals 10 and B equals 5. Now C is going to be the sum of A plus B. And then we're going to echo out the result like this. So if we refresh our screen, you'll see that the sum of 10 plus 5 is 15. Now, it is important that you return your value. Otherwise, if we remove our return statement and we refresh, you'll see that nothing comes back. So the result of your sum function is just going into the void and it's going nowhere. So let's put our return statement back and refresh, and you see it's working again. Okay, next let's look at some string functions. Now, string functions in PHP are built-in helper functions that provides like excellent support for manipulating a string. The first one we're going to look at is string to lower, which takes the string that you provide and it returns it all in lowercase. So if we refresh, you'll see it's all in lowercase now. The second one we're going to look at is the opposite. It's string to upper. So it'll take the string whatever you provide and it'll return the uppercase of that string. Let's refresh and see. And there we go. It's all in uppercase. The next one we'll be looking at is the trim function. Now the trim function, it trims all the white space before and after your string. So it'll remove this white space here and that space here. So if we refresh, you'll see there's no white space in front or at the end. The next one we're looking at is the string position. The string position is strpos, which returns the position of the first occurrence of the character you specify. So in this case, we want to search for the first space. In that case, it'll return number 3. So the index of a string always starts with 0. So it'll be 0, 1, 2, 3. Next, let's look at the substring. The substring returns a piece of the string you specify. So you don't want the whole string back, you only want a certain piece of the string. So the first argument is the string you provide, then you specify the starting position, and then for how long it needs to, or the length of string it needs to return. So in this case, we want to start at position 0, which is the P, and it needs to go for 3 characters. So it'll be 1, 2, 3. It'll return the string PHP. Next, let's look at string reverse, which is basically what it says. It'll return your string in reverse order. If we refresh, you'll see our string is now in reverse. Next, let's look at string shuffle, which basically, as the name suggests, it'll shuffle the letters in your string. So if we refresh and we refresh again, you'll see it keeps shuffling the order of your characters. Next, let's look at the string replace. Now, string replace takes the first argument, character you're looking for. The second argument is what you want to replace it with. And the third argument is the string you want to replace it in. So in this case, we're looking for all the spaces and we want to replace it with a dash in this string. So now if we refresh, you'll see all the spaces have been replaced with dashes. And the last one we're going to look at is the string length, which basically returns the length in characters for your string. So if we refresh, this string is 12 characters long. Okay, next let's look at the PHP superglobals. Now, a superglobal is a variable that is provided by PHP that is available anywhere within your project. It doesn't matter in which script or in which file you are, the superglobal variables are always available. Now, there are many different superglobals available, but the ones we'll be looking at is the get and the post superglobal. Now, in order to view this, we're going to use a simple login form and we're going to dump out the information on the screen that we get from the superglobal. Now, as you can see, I've set up the form to submit to the index.php file, which is the current file we are coding in. Then the method I'm going to set as get. PHP will then take all the information, submit it in the form, and place it in the get superglobal. So if we enter our email, test@email.com, and we say type in a random password, and if we submit, you can now see the get superglobal has been dumped on the screen and it received our information like this. Now you can also see using a get as your method in a form for a login mechanism is not a good idea, because HTML will then submit those details within the URL of your project. So it'll expose your password. So for the best experience, you want to use the method post in a form that has sensitive information in it. So now let's just refresh. And now we can change this to post. And we type in our email again, test@email.com. And if we log in, now you can see, as you can see, the fields are not in the URL, which is a lot safer. And you can see the post superglobal now has our credentials stored. Now, all the superglobals in PHP provide a lot of information and functionality, but as a best practice should always be used in a read-only manner. You should never change the information in a superglobal directly. Now, let's look at form security and cross-site scripting. Now, form security is really important because that will prevent security attacks like cross-site scripting from ruining your site. Now, cross-site scripting is when a malicious user injects bad code in your form in order to break your application. Let's use this as an example. On our login form, I'm going to place some bad code in the email. And what we're going to do is, without sanitizing the input, I'm going to echo out whatever I received on the email. So if I press OK, you see that we received a pop-up that say, hey, you're hacked. That is a way of injecting malicious code into your website. Now, a way around this is to sanitize your input. And you use the filter input helper function in order to do that. So the first argument of this function is the type. And we're going to sanitize our post variable because we've selected post up here. Then the second argument is the field we want to sanitize. That'll be our email field. And the third argument is the filter. We want to sanitize special characters. And let's see how this works. And we press login. You'll see that the special character is now being escaped and just the string is displayed on the screen. Now, another filter we can use to sanitize a user email is the filter sanitize email. Now, that will sanitize the user's input and return the email within that input. So as an example, let's say test@email.com, and let's add some illegal characters. That's not allowed. Illegal characters are not allowed in an email address. So we had some brackets and some parentheses. So now if we press login, you'll see it's not working. That is because I did not save my file. So if we copy this input, put it back in and log in, now you can see the email address has been sanitized from that input. Now, another way to validate a user's input is to use a different kind of filter. Now, with a sanitize filter, the filter input function will remove all the illegal characters that it could find within your input. With a validation filter, like filter validate email, that will check whether the email or the input you've provided is an email or not. It won't remove any illegal characters. So let's see how this works. So now it's going to validate if my email is correct and it's going to return my email. See, nothing has changed. But now if we add some illegal characters, it's going to return nothing because, again, I haven't saved. Let's do this again. So test@email.com. Let's add some illegal characters and now press login. And because that validation has failed, that function returned an empty response. There's a bunch of filters that you can use in order to validate or sanitize your user's input and use them accordingly. Now, let's look at the include function. The include function is really important. As your project grows and it gets bigger, you want to separate your content into their own separate files to make your code more organized. That is where you will use the include function. So the include function will allow you to include data or content from other files. Let's take our index.php for example. Currently, there's only the include statement, but it still renders out our form that is on the screen. Now that is because our form is now located in the included file.php. If we go to that file, you'll see there is our HTML form that is being rendered on the screen. Now, the include function also allows you to pass variables from one file to another. So let's take this for an example. We want to render out the email and password that we receive on the screen. So let's open up our PHP tags. You want to say echo the email address is, and we're going to type in email and just add our line break. Then we're going to say echo the password is, and we're going to say password. We're going to add a line break. Now if we refresh, you'll see you'll get an error because those variables does not exist yet. So let's go back to our index.php file and we create a variable called email, and we'll get the information from our post email, and we'll do the same for our password. Now if we refresh, you won't see anything because we haven't entered anything. So let's say our email is test@email.com and our password is password. Now you can see those variables have been created in our index.php file and then passed down to our include file.php. And that is why it is now being rendered out on the screen. And I think that will conclude this beginner's tutorial for learning PHP. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next one.